Born and raised in the Liberties in inner city Dublin, that I got 120 points in my leaving cert. I had been in a situation where I was on the dole for probably 6 or 8 months. You realise, at some point how low you actually were. So one of the biggest challenges I had in the early days, I had no clinical background. We became sort of the first mama and papa business to dethrone the big boys. We were turning over 22 million. We had a 10% net profit and we employed about 70 people. When I left, we were dealing with all, hospitals, 120 hospitals within the HSE, 20 private hospitals, 40 hospitals up in Northern Ireland, the NHS, 3 universities. That was the only option that was open to me at the time, was to sell the business. I actually decided, maybe there is a price. Maybe now is the time to actually leave. And I bought it for 80,000. When I exited, the exit multiple on what I purchased it for was a multiple of... It's a very, very difficult process. But yeah, it's your baby. You give it up. You have doubts. I'm not ashamed to say I had a lot of sleepless nights.
So today's guest is Aidan O'Reilly. Aidan is the previous owner and CEO of Medray. Medray is a company that is a leading provider of healthcare equipment across Ireland and the UK. Welcome to the podcast, Aidan.
Thank you, Alan. Welcome to be here.
Thanks, Aidan. So Aidan, can you share a bit about your background from your early years to the career path that inspired you to start Medray?
Yeah, certainly. Born and raised in the Liberties in inner city Dublin or whatever, one of a family of 6. My dad was a builder. Now, he wasn't the type of builder that went around in a Toyota Land Cruiser, He basically just went from job to job. He was more a 2-bit chippy or carpenter, sort of say, that sort of way. So he earned a living going, as I say, from extension to extension. And there was periods, and I remember them well, when, 3-4 weeks would go by, and in those days they didn't really provide for the future. In some respects, they just lived from week to week, particularly when you've got trying to raise 6 children. So there was times when we did without. But I suppose I saw firsthand at that point the ups and downs of being a self-employed builder or entrepreneur and that type of stuff, So that's sort of my early recollection of sort of business, and it probably stems initially from that, from my father's perspective. Both my parents were from the country, so when summer came, we were always farmed off down to either Galway or Cavan from where they came from. So typically for the first probably sort of 8 to 15 years of age, I would have gone to Galway and worked there. And it's a very different, you learn roads, and thankfully I've retained most of it. And I do have a genuine love for rural Ireland. But during those years, it was pretty much on the go, as you can appreciate in a farming community, from early morning till late at night. And you got to learn the hard work and the non-stop, it wasn't a clock watching sort of exercise. And then I suppose as I went into my sort of late teens, I sort of went to my father's place down in Cavan, and I had an uncle who had a supermarket and another uncle who had a pub. And I used to work in the supermarket during the day and work in the pub at night. And I used to spend my weekends down there. So again, that gave me a good understanding, and it further expanded my knowledge in terms of, I suppose I didn't realize it at the time, in terms of business, but also of customer relationships where you're dealing with people. So that was sort of my introduction into the sort of the business world, if you like to call it, from a very early cradle stages.
Brilliant. Very good. And then what led you to decide to start Medray? Were you in the medical business before that, or?
No, it's like everything, I had a probably checkered career, but always in the sort of the photographic film imaging business, having worked with Agfa, having worked with Konica, and as you do, in order to progress in your career, you spend 2, 3 years here and then you move on 2, 3 years there and that type of thing. And you're constantly trying to better yourself. So I suppose that's where I was. I was in at a stage where I'd made several moves. I'd moved up from being, sales manager at sort of 24, 25. I was sales director at 29. And one day I got a phone call from an ex-MD, and he said, listen, I have this business that we have that we're trying to get rid of. He says, and would you have any interest in it, in bolting on to what I had already, which was two high street print shops. So I said, yeah, absolutely. You always have to be open to something like this. And when he asked me, he said I was interested in buying an X-ray medical wholesale distribution business, and not coming from a clinical background or having any third level education. I do joke with the kids here that I got 120 points in my leaving cert, which was 3Cs and 3Ds. I wasn't I wouldn't say I was blessed with the brains or whatever, but I suppose just it's hard work and gut feeling, which is a lot of what success is for somebody who's been successful in business. I think it's those two characteristics is something that you need. So he was looking for 80,000 pounds for the business, and at the time it was turning over about 800,000 and had 4 staff. So needless to say, I hadn't got 80,000, but I sort of pooled together from as an upfront 20,000 as an upfront payment, and then agreed to pay him the other 60,000 at 12,000 a year over the next 5 years. So that's pretty much how I sort of stumbled into that business. And it really is, things will come and go in your life, and you'll get opportunities, and it doesn't matter whether it's personally or financially, or whether it's got to do with property or businesses or whatever. You just need to know when to grasp the nettle. And it's a little bit like stocks and shares today. Are they going to be bigger tomorrow, or will I actually sell today? And you have to know and have a gut feeling of when to buy or when to sell. And I suppose I must have had some sort of an idea that this was a good business opportunity. And basically I took it and ran with it. Yeah. With no clinical background or.
Yeah, I suppose, Aidan, did you have any sort of kind of fears or going into an industry and a background you hadn't been involved in at all? Did that fear you at all, and if it did, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's unique to me or unique to entrepreneurs or successful people in business in general, but I don't believe you can have a fear. I think once you have the gut feeling, it's all about them believing in yourself. And once you get that gut feeling, and it's the thing to do, it's pretty much you have to go out there and follow the dream, and I suppose that's what I did. I got an opportunity. I've had opportunities and I've regretted them, whether it was in property or business, and turned them down. And hindsight is always, it just happened that I made the right decision. And I suppose I didn't have fear, because when you're 30 years of age and you've got a couple of young kids, it's, if you let fear get in front of that, you won't make the decision. And you certainly, you'll always opt for the safe ground unless you're a sort of a risk taker. And I suppose that's what entrepreneurs are. They are risk takers,
Yeah, brilliant. And when you bought the business and you put the 20K down, was that basically all your wealth at the time?
Oh, absolutely, Alan. I mean, say you're talking about, all you had was a PAYE salary. I mean, to say, I didn't come with a silver spoon, and I didn't have parents who had businesses or was able to support me. That was typical back in the sort of the 80s and 90s, the case may be, and early 2000s, that, because there were so many siblings, and, there was very few people in business, if you know what I mean, to pass it on. So, no, I didn't have anything. I literally started, and if the truth was known, I probably took a loan out to service that startup injection that I needed to
Brilliant.
put into the
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. Risk well paid off anyway.
Yeah, I had a high street business in Rathmines and in Kevin Street. So I had a location and I had a property. So that was a sort of a cost that I didn't have to start to consider. It was more a case of how do you just move a business that's turning over X amount into Rathmines as where we started off. So, it was generating cash all the time. And because of the type of customer we were dealing with, there was never a cash flow issue. So yeah, it was probably easier in hindsight when I look back than it might be for other people, that sort of way, because some things did align.
Yeah.
So I was out on my own at the time. I had been in a situation where I was on the dole for probably 6 or 8 months if I wind the clock back a couple of years previous to that. And then you begin to know, the value of a pound. But then when you start to climb the ladder, you realize, at some point how low you actually were. So, yeah, I mean to say, I didn't have anything other than, a sense that it would work or I could make it work.
Yeah, I suppose then, Aidan, if we could maybe discuss more about what kind of Medray do, and maybe if at the start was it selling different products and how it's maybe potentially grown to, let's say in whatever the 20 years you were there.
Yeah, when we were involved in it, we were selling X-ray equipment. It was selling X-ray equipment. Majority of what we were selling actually was X-ray film. And if you cast your mind back sort of 20 years, you went out with a camera, you took your photographs with your household camera, you got them developed, and you had them the next day. It's not too dissimilar to how X-rays were taken. You took an X-ray of somebody, it was taken on a film, it was processed in a machine, a processor, and then 10 minutes later or 15 minutes later, you had an image. So when I started the business, we were selling an awful lot of X-ray film, which was consumable, which wasn't affected by seasonality. So we didn't sell any more in summer than we sell in winter. So, if anything, we sold more probably in the winter because of trips and slips and falls and that type of stuff. But the industry changed and the technology changed and we had to change with it. So we had to move from being an analog based business, which was selling X-ray film, to then selling what we would say is sort of digital product. Digital film was coming on, and then it is now filmless, and it's basically just a digital X-ray machine, much the same way as your iPhone is today. You just take an image and up it pops. So we had that transition from analog into digital. So I was moving very much from a consumable-based product into a capital-based product. So instead of selling somebody X-ray film, I was now selling them X-ray machines. So in the initial, over the 20 years, that has been a transition that the business had to make from the time I acquired the business until the time I exited the business. So in the very early days, we just dealt with maybe 20 or 30 hospitals in Ireland. When I left, we were dealing with all hospitals, 120 hospitals within the HSE, 20 private hospitals, 40 hospitals up in Northern Ireland, the NHS, 3 universities, Queen's University, Cork University, and UCD, where they teach people how to take X-rays. So anywhere you see X-ray, that's where Medray was, and that's why Medray had a fingerprint. So it extended outside. I extended the business outside of just hospitals. So we started to, if you think about it, where else do you use X-ray? You use it in a dental, so the dentists use X-ray, veterinary, X-raying pets or whatever, horses, etc., and then chiropractors. So we started to develop into those areas. That's another transition and a whole new transition that we didn't have when we started off, that we sort of changed or turned the company towards in the latter years. So X-ray equipment, X-ray accessories, lead protections, the aprons you wear, lead-lined rooms, all that type of thing. And then as well as we were calling on dentists and we were calling on vets, we started to develop a range of consumables. So we weren't just selling them a bit like in the paint world. We weren't just selling them paint. All of a sudden now we were selling them brushes and overalls, and we were selling them wallpaper paste. So we moved from just being an equipment based to being somebody who was a one-stop shop. So you could get your accessories, get your lead protection. All this stuff was coming in from the UK. Brilliant. So we were coming a one-stop shop here in Ireland. So when we exited, it was pretty much X-ray equipment, accessories, consumables into dentists, into veterinary, and service support. And the type of consumables in vets and dentists are the type of implements that they use, needles, swabs, bandaging, all that type of thing that you would see typically in a veterinary practice.
Brilliant. So lots of recurring revenue then coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But for a change, our reps, our salespeople were going in, and rather than saying, "Do you want to buy an X-ray equipment for €250,000 or 200,000 euros?" and he'd say, "No, thanks. We won't be doing that for about another 4 or 5 years." At least he was going into the vet and the dentist who was buying, we were selling equipment to, and say, "Listen, but what do you want that we can actually deliver tomorrow?" So we started to build up a customer base, but then obviously a sales funnel that was actually the hopper was being filled every single day by reps who are going into vets, dentists, and of course hospitals as well, who use various other consumables on the radiology side of things.
But again, Aidan, what's interesting is you discuss, the change that came about in the equipment. I think it's interesting with the fact AI coming in now. What did you think was important about dealing with changes like that, and what do you feel helped the business about? Obviously, you're very successful with going with this change, but what did you feel was the most important thing about kind of going with change and taking advantage of it?
Well, to be honest, what I tended to do was I always attended the different trade shows around the world. The biggest one is on in Chicago every single November, and there's one in Europe in Vienna in April. So they're 6 months, 7 months apart. So basically what I did was I kept informed of what technology was coming. I looked at various we weren't just a one-horse brand in terms of we didn't just have a single product from a single supplier. We had multiple products, maybe over 20 or 30 different companies. So we would look and see where the cutting edge was coming from, whether it was represented here in Ireland. And we were quite fortunate with one of our biggest brands we had, which was Carestream, that they were at the time cutting edge. So although they are in a different place now than they were back in 2012, they were at the cutting edge of digital radiology then, which was the period of time when I was moving from analog to digital. And you're quite right, Sean. Now the challenge for companies like Medray is how do they deal with the AI that's coming into medical. I suppose to answer your question, I didn't really have to face that challenge of AI. It was more a case of the analog to digital. But I suppose if you were faced with that challenge today, it would be no different than what I did. You would have to be going to these conferences, these trade shows to see what companies are out there, new companies coming on with new technologies and that type of stuff. And then try and get the distribution rights for Ireland, which essentially is, at the time I was building the business over a 20-year period, I was only ever concentrating on the island of Ireland, because I was getting the customer into a position where you don't have to go outside Ireland, you don't have to go to the UK to buy certain equipment, which was happening in the 70s and 80s.
What were some of the key performance metrics then that you would have looked at on a monthly basis when you were with Medray?
I suppose I was probably ahead of the curve in terms of I was probably obsessed with Excel and matrices, and I know Tom Cruise was moving objects around a glass screen on a movie at one stage, and I actually sort of fancied myself in that role in that sort of way, whereas actually I could actually move things around and see. But I suppose the key matrix in most businesses is cost control, and also sales by division, performance by division, And I actually got a reputation for myself as that sort of at 4 o'clock every single Friday, I'd ask the girls for the figures, and they'd send me in a sort of a single spread, a single printout from the computer that would have the sales and the margin, per division for the month to date. So I was always on top of figures and knowing what the sales were, what was performing, what wasn't, what was in the pipeline, where the costs were and that type of stuff. So I kept a very, very tight control, sales, particularly on a weekly basis. And then we had sort of management meetings, and we'd have a set of management accounts that would come in on a monthly basis. And we'd sit down and we would discuss those. Obviously, the costs that came up unexpectedly, the previous, what we would need to spend on going forward. So a certain element of planning and that type of thing. So yeah, I said they're the sort of keeping my finger on the pulse, I think, is really what you would, and then putting the software solutions to give me that information very quickly and easily. And I had several bits of sort of plug-in software that monitored engineers. We went digital in terms of engineers clicking when they'd leave home. We would be able to see that on a screen. We would be able to tell a customer from that location at home how long he would be to be at the actual hospital. He would click when he gets to the hospital, arrive. He click when he starts work. He click when he finishes work. And then he click when he get home. So we were able to map out a guy and know how much of his time was spent traveling, how much of his time was on site. We were able to see at a flick of a button, we could see any particular hospital, how many hours we have spent driving to that hospital, how many times we've been there on either services, on preventive maintenance calls. So we were able to relocate and hire engineers. When I left, I had an engineer based in Sligo. I had one based in Cork. I had one based in Belfast. I had another one in Carlow, and I had a couple in Dublin. I had one in Cork. So what I did was I built a engineering support team to support the industry around locations where I actually knew we actually had an awful lot of machines in Cork, or we had an awful lot of machines up in Belfast. So it was with the help of those matrices that helped me to make key decisions in terms of resources going forward.
Brilliant. And then what do you think made Medray so successful? Like, why do customers buy from you over another competitor that had different suppliers?
You like to think is that we were customer focused and we gave a very personalized service and we built up relationships with people. And at the end of the day, it's an old cliche, people buy from people. Another thing we did was we supported the industry. I was the first person globally, I believe, because I couldn't find anybody when I Google searched it back in 2016, to give the X-ray awards, a national awards called the Radiology X-ray Awards. So we would be sponsoring Radiographer of the Year, Radiotherapist of the Year, X-ray Department of the Year, Radiology Department of the Year. So we were sponsoring and supporting the industry and going to awards where you'd have 200 or 300 people who would be in a buying capacity, and you were the headline, sort of the awards was the headline of the gala evening. I came up with innovative ways, that sort of way. And we also came up with it when we were doing that and probably spending it on the Irish market. A lot of our the bigger companies who were here in Ireland were beginning to move back to the UK and starting to run Ireland by remote control. So if a hospital rang one of the big five, as we used to call them, they were patched through to the UK. And the people in the UK thought Kent Station was just outside London when it's actually down in Cork. And they thought St. Luke's Hospital was in Rathgar when actually St. Luke's Hospital is actually in Kilkenny. Yeah. So there was that for me, when other companies were, after the crash in or 2010, a lot of big companies, when we became successful, their market share fell. And the only way they could deal with that was to reduce their cost. And part of their cost reduction was to actually bring some of their resources, engineering, administrative, finance, back to the UK. So that was how we probably won business as well. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. I suppose then, Aidan, if we could kind of look at revenues as the company's grown, like say if we go back to maybe not all the way when you started the company, but as to when you left, could you maybe summarize how the company grew in sales and then if in margins as well, if you can?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, it was doing 800,000 or whatever, and I bought it for 80,000. When I exited, the exit multiple on what I purchased it for was a multiple of 100. So that's the development of the company over a 20-year period. So I suppose by adding various brands, by looking at opportunities, by closing off those doors that people used to go to the UK and now they were buying from us, we were adding products to our portfolio. So irrespective of the fact that we probably had a very turbulent time in the recession in 2008 to 2011, we continued to grow even through that, because what we did was we moved a part of our focus up to Northern Ireland. So even though, the HSE had no money, Ireland was a basket case or whatever the case may be, we identified that, there was an opportunity up in Northern Ireland. So we actually focused on Northern Ireland, and year on year, we actually had growth for over 20 years, irrespective of the economic climate that was out there. So that's how we sort of built it. So to give you numbers, Sean, when we exited, we were turning over 22 million. We had a 10% net profit, and we employed about 70 people. And I suppose to fill in that piece earlier, we were so successful here in Ireland that Carestream also had a subsidiary of its own in the UK where they managed the business, and which we reported into. But at the end, after about 10 years, we were actually bigger than the UK was. Oh. And they have a multiple, they say 16 in terms of population. I believe in terms of business, we're probably about 8 or 10 times smaller than the UK, but we were actually outselling the UK. So it got to a point just prior to me exiting where we were giving the distribution rights for the UK. So we got the distribution rights, and we bought out the subsidiary in the UK. Such was the success that we were having, and the business model that we had here in Ireland that they couldn't replicate over in the UK.
And obviously you were grown massively. How did you manage that? Like, you'd never grown a business like that before. Did you bring?
No, but we are always in yeah, the great thing about dealing, well, we did invoice discounting in terms of vets and dentists and that type of stuff. So we were getting paid 80% after 30 days. So there was never a cash flow issue. The other thing, under the Prompt Payment Act within the public procurement system, they have to pay you within 45 days. So, I was being paid for stuff before I had to pay the supplier within 60 days. Okay. So the growth wasn't hindered through finance. So that's and the other thing is that we grew the business. One of the strategies I had when I grew the business was, if I sold an X-ray machine and only made 5 or 10%, and that meant I was 5 or 10% cheaper than my competitor, I always identified very early that once an X-ray machine goes in, it actually stays in an Irish hospital for at least 15 years. So the reoccurring revenue coming off that sale is with you for the next 15 years. So when I left Medray, we had a reoccurring revenue of about 2.2 million, which we raised invoices for on the 1st of January. So I was actually paid on the 1st of January for work that I hadn't even done.
Brilliant.
So that was one of the reasons why we actually got traction and why we were so successful against some of the competitors, because they weren't willing. If you take GE, Siemens, Toshiba, Canon, any of these big multinationals who spent more on marketing than I probably spent in a year, they weren't willing to work for any less than 30-40% margin. But I was willing to work for 10% margin, knowing that I was going to get a recurring revenue off that machine for the next 15 years. So that was my business model.
Yeah. Very good.
So it was,
long-term
and once you had client reference, once you had traction, once everybody knew that, oh sure, everybody's buying that particular machine, that's the model that everyone is buying. That actually made the sales easier going forward. Yeah.
And is that recurring revenue? Is that from maintenance?
Maintenance, yeah. Pure maintenance or whatever. Yeah.
So there'd be a set schedule that like a car.
Yeah, it used to be 4 times a year or whatever the case may be, where you'd send somebody in. Now, you'd probably have to do a half day's work when in reality all that was needed was, it'd be a bit like your car outside. You know, you were getting £4,000 or £5,000 for call out, send an engineer and just, you know, only had to be change the oil and keep the thing turning over. It wasn't that there was major components ever needed in these things. Once you're servicing them regularly, you're keeping the costs of preventative maintenance keeps down the cost of call outs and that type of stuff, you know.
Yeah, I suppose, as we've discussed maybe the recession and stuff, but throughout your 20 years in Medray, if you could maybe narrow it down to maybe 3, what were the 3 biggest challenges you faced within those years, and how did you overcome them?
Ooh, well, I suppose one of the challenges I had in some respects was I sold an X-ray machine to a private hospital down in Cork, and at the time it was big money. I think it was 50 or 60,000, and you're going back to 2003. I didn't know whether the X-ray film went in one end or came in the other end, and what end it came out. And I swear to God, I hadn't got a clue. So one of the biggest challenges I had in the early days, I had no clinical background. But I suppose I had a very clever commercial brain. So sometimes I got struggled to get buy-in with customers. So I suppose at the early stages, I probably would have struggled trying to search for an identity about what I was really about. But I suppose I surrounded myself and hired people who had that either technical, because I'm not an engineer, so they had either technical know-how or clinical know-how. That certainly was a struggle. The other things is that I suppose from Medray in the early days, we were sort of searching for an identity, searching to know what exactly we were. There's a certain amount of uncertainty. We got involved in medical consumables, bought a warehouse full of it and never sold it, and probably ended up, putting it in the bin. We got agencies, what we thought were, fantastic products from China, from Korea, that didn't have the brand support and they weren't on the same timelines as we were. So support was an issue or whatever the case would be. So yeah, there was times when we struggled, to find the products. And it was only towards the last sort of 8 to 10 years that we found an identity that Medray was an X-ray company, and we sold everything that went to X-ray rather than trying to fit stuff that went into hospitals. We started at wheelchairs, we started at, various different stainless steel tables and all that type of stuff, but that wasn't what Medray was about. So, we struggled to find the niche, but it took us 10 years maybe, but eventually we settled on being an X-ray company. And I suppose one of the reasons why we struggled was that, we never thought we would get, and we never thought we would be considered a brand outside of the big five when, we had no X-ray rooms when the big five had all of the X-ray rooms. So it wasn't until 2012, we entered a tender process with the HSE, and we lost that tender. And we had a debriefing, and we found out that the winning submission gave a 2-year warranty. So we had to wait 4 years. And in that 2012 to 2016, we were up in Northern Ireland winning business. So we went back and we became in 2016, we won the national tender to supply the HSE. And for the first time, they went for an exclusive model where there was only going to be one supplier supplying all the X-ray rooms, and the hospitals didn't have a choice. Before then, the hospital had a choice. So we became sort of the first mama and papa business to dethrone the big boys, the GEs, Siemens, Canons, Toshibas of this world. So that was colossal. That was a huge turning point. We were now going to be sell something that we'd never sold before, but we had the product with Carestream that was market leader elsewhere in the world. We retained that again in 2020. So with the time of exiting every single X-ray room, about 70% of X-ray rooms that's in Ireland at the moment is all coming out from Medray. And I don't know what they've done in the last 5 years.
Brilliant.
I know they've been successful.
Yeah, it's a great contract to win.
Yeah.
And then what was kind of the most enjoyable moments in your time there? Some of the highlights that you had. You mentioned that contract. But
that contract is huge. It's funny, the small things, the £50,000 loan that or order that we got at the very, very start, when you're only used to selling, print for a couple of, 10 or 20, 40 quid, to get an order for somebody for €50,000, your first big order. It doesn't matter what business you're in, and I'm sure you'll hear stories from other people who remember the first big one, that sort of way. And then things that changed, I suppose, acquiring the Carestream agency. And it wasn't an overnight success. I remember going to a meeting, having sold only one machine in 2011, and the boss man in the UK saying, doing well, have to do better, that sort of way. And you're really on a probation period because those exclusive distribution rights normally are 2 years with a 2-year rollover. So your year one in, you sold one machine. So when you start to get traction with Carestream, and then you start to build a brand over here, and I suppose to get a brand that's bigger than the subsidiary, its own subsidiary in the UK, and then they end up closing that in the UK and saying, we'd like to make Medray the distribution partners for Ireland and the UK. And if you bring that success on, just in November of last year, Medray as a brand, Medray as a company, got the distribution rights for Switzerland.
Brilliant.
So, all of that, I always say, is built on the foundations of Medray. Because 80% of the product they sell today, 80% of the customers that they sell today are the customers that we built over a 20-year period. So when you exit a business, what have you leave? If you leave a foundation, and really the venture capitalists that come in, predominantly what happens now is venture capitalists come in, and they come in and all they do really is add an extension onto the business, but they can never really change the formation or the foundation of the company. They're only ever adding on to it.
Yeah.
The sort of way. So that plus the tender that we won in 2016 were probably the highlights. Yeah. And, on a personal level, I remember probably around 2017, one of the things and one of the cultures that I developed is always look after your staff. And we had a fantastic culture inside. We had very, very few people that actually left the company in all the time that I was there. Some of them are very, very dear friends, even now. Some of the people have risen and within Medray, 4 or 5 years after I've gone. But we used to go typically either greyhound racing or to Leopardstown on a summer's evening and bring the staff out and give them. And we used to go on a Christmas party, and we'd stay overnight in some hotel, and we'd have the Christmas party. And it's amazing the bond that you create and the culture that you create by looking after people. And I remember in 2017 we were down in Athlone, and I had this sort of reward for staff that I gave them a watch when they were 10-year service, and people were on an annual basis were beginning to be 10 years in the business, and we'd make a presentation to the watch. But I suppose I got a sort of a piece of glass that was an appreciation award from the staff for being who I was and for building Medray for what it is. And I suppose that's probably the single biggest, accolade that I could actually say, that it wasn't never all about me.
Yeah.
It was always about Medray. It was always about the staff.
Yeah.
And I think that was a nice memento, and that was something that I'll cherish forever, I suppose,
Yeah, I think it's great when you talk about, all the sales you did and how successful the company became, and when you look at the personal moments that it was something as simple as that really made all your work worthwhile, which is really special.
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose, Aidan, we'll move on to the sale, I suppose, now, if that's okay. If you could tell us what happened and I suppose how the sale came about.
Yeah, well, it's like anything, you get to a point in life and you promise yourself growing up that you think you're going to be a millionaire at 40 and I'm going to retire at 40. And then you move that dial and you say, I'm going to leave when I'm 50, and then you're approaching 60 and you're still there and you're still flogging away or whatever the case may be. So you sort of have a situation where you really have, and everybody who owns a business has three choices. And those three choices are: you can sell your business, you can stay in your business and you can go out in a wooden box. And some people take those two choices, or you can give it to your children. And I know you're familiar with my guys. They've been in there for summers. Paul came and he worked, didn't like it or whatever. He now regrets it, but hence 10 years later, that was the only option that was open to me at the time, was to sell the business, because my kids weren't interested in it. And I wasn't planning to stay there till I was going out in a box. So I actually decided, you know what, maybe there is a price. Maybe now is the time to actually leave. And that whole acquisition process probably started with a phone call, but typical of a sales guy, he grabs it and then before you know it, you're actually inside in a process, that sort of way. And he's bringing in interested parties and that type of thing. So the thing begins at something more inquisitive, that you're actually saying, yeah, sure, I'll have a chat with them and see what's involved or what do they think. And then before you know it, you're actually halfway down a process and that type of stuff, that sort of way. So that's how it all came by. Would I say, was it for sale at the time? There wasn't a for sale sign outside, but probably inside of my head, I actually thought maybe there would be some sort of an exit process. And I had no idea what that might actually look like. So, yeah, that's pretty much how the acquisition and the sale of the business came about.
And was there many potential buyers?
Yeah, you get
time.
Yeah.
Or...
In fairness to the people, they brought probably about 4 different people to the party, and I probably made a fundamental mistake. A very, very good friend of mine, Jerry Kennelly, had sold Stockbite down in Kerry many years previous, and he was a good friend of mine, and I rang him up, and he'd sold his business for 135 million to Getty Imaging. And I rang him and he said to me, do it yourself. Ring up some of the fellas in your industry and see, are they interested? And I was probably too full of pride that I didn't want my competitors to know what my numbers were. And I sort of felt that if I actually go out to the market, there might be people might see that as a weakness or a vulnerability. So I actually went to a company who buys and sells, or sells, should I say. And yeah, that's how it all started. And the one regret in hindsight was I probably had 3 people. One had a look, was very, very interested, and said, unfortunately, the deal is too small. In other words, the transaction value, they would have to put as much due diligence and 6 or 8 months into it to buy a £6 million company is a £60 million company.
Yeah. And
then there was another ones that came, loved the business and said, unfortunately, our reach isn't into the UK, and unfortunately, I wasn't in a position to say, well, UK will be coming. So because we were only Irish, they weren't overly enthusiastic about proceeding. And then another crowd came and they loved it, and they were all over it from a very, very early stages. And I thought they were the right partners. And I suppose when somebody's dangling a check, the check part is the fact that they're the right people, but in hindsight, afterwards you don't realize where they were or where they weren't, that sort of way.
Yeah, very good. And how was the deal structured? Did you have to stay on for a certain period?
Yeah, basically what happened, Alan, was that I sold 75% and I retained 25%. And the people who bought me were venture capitalists, and they had no idea about the X-ray business. They had no medical experience. I think they were involved in acquisition of maybe a telecoms business before, but they very quickly, and this is something that I've learned, that 99% of people are good people, but there's always 1% of people who actually make it the other 99 be tarnished as not being nice people. But these people didn't turn out, and they didn't deliver on what they promised. In other words, I was supposed to stay there for 5 years, and then we were going to flip the business in 5 years' time, and then I get a 25% stake on the uplift. But they came in and they started to put in people who got in my way, who started to question what we were doing, and I think the deal might have been a little bit too strong for them. And I think they might have been a little bit paranoid that we put a lot of money into this, and they were only a startup VC, and they probably felt we've got to keep an eye on this, because if this goes, we may end up with, very little for our money. So they probably just clouded me, and they, crowded me out, should I say. And I couldn't work. Having worked for 20 years, answerable just to myself, and now all of a sudden you've got development committees coming in on a Monday morning, and I knew the board meeting piece was going to be something I'd have to adapt to, but it just got too claustrophobic for me, and I felt, I had to explain every single decision. And unfortunately, maybe it's the reason why entrepreneurs are successful, is that they don't have to answer for anybody. And I just found that very, very difficult. And after about 12 months, I said, guys, I'm sorry, but I'm out of here. I said, I've left the number 2 there, and I need a price, and I need to get out. And I probably undersold the exit piece.
All right.
But I had the exit. I had some cards in my back pocket, because I just delivered the UK piece to them. So I got a price that I was happy with, and I just decided, right. Yeah. It was a 12-month process. So many, September close, October close, November close, and then eventually December close. So there's a lot of false dawns, an awful lot of work that you've got to do in preparing stuff for Grant Thornton's or KPMG or PwC. They come in under the hood, and then they sort of ask you questions, and then they come in the following week and they ask you the same questions again. So it's a very, very difficult process. And unfortunately, then I found the people that I sold it to weren't as nice a people as I thought when they were coming in, because they didn't let me do. And I do believe it's to their detriment, because with the support that they would have given, and they went on. I had made 2 or 3 acquisitions during the 20 years. I had 1 teed up before I left. They made 2 or 3 since, and I do believe that I would have delivered a much better company to them 5 years later if they had left me on my own, as opposed to me leaving and they having to get somebody else in to deliver a result for them within 5 years.
I suppose, Aidan, how does it feel, when you've put in 20 years of work into a company, and then, I know that you were saying it's a long process, but then eventually the day comes and that's it, it's gone, or it's not gone, but it's past you anyway. What's that feeling like when it's all over?
You know what? The first 2 or 3 weeks is a little bit like on holiday, that sort of way. And holidays are always great, but if you went to live there for a month or 6 weeks, where it's in Spain or Italy, it might change your mind. So there's a honeymoon period, certainly, for about a month. So I actually rented an office. To answer your question, I rented an office up in Baldonnel beside where we were, and every single day for 12 months, I went up to the office, and I had 6,000 photographs on my computer, and I tagged every single one of them, and I got rid of the good ones and the bad ones, or all that type of stuff, just to keep myself busy. But it's your baby. You give it up. You have doubts. I'm not ashamed to say I had a lot of sleepless nights. I wished, did I do the right thing? You have regrets, and that sometimes you can make a decision, but you can go back and you can rectify that decision. When you build up something for 20 years, you actually can't go back. you've sold it, it's gone, it's too late, that sort of way. So yeah, I'd safely say it would probably took me about a year and a half to get my head into a position where I didn't miss it. But the amount of anger that could become built up on you in some respects, because you actually begin to wish the company bad, which is not a nice place. And I don't know whether it's just me or whether it's in general with people, but you actually start to wish, geez, I wish I could buy them back for £1. Oh, I hope they go bust. I'll buy them back for £1, that sort of way.
Yeah.
So those thoughts do go through your head, or whatever the case may be. I was very active in the garden and that type of stuff. And slowly but surely, and I've had opportunities, and I've had people come to me, and after the 2-year non-compete was up, there was 1 or 2 agencies, but I actually said, it took me 20 years to build Medray to success it was. Why do I want, at 60 years of age now, to build something again that's going to not be worth anything for another 20 years maybe, and then I'm not going to get any benefit? Only the decision I decided not to go out in a box, I'd actually reverse that decision and say I will be going out in a box. So a lot of regrets. It is your baby, and you wonder whether it's the right thing or not. And yeah, it was a difficult time for, as I say, certainly 18 months for 2 years. But now I'm out the other side. I still get calls on a consultancy basis. Only had a meeting yesterday with somebody who's looking to expand into the Irish market, who is a friend of mine, which I'll probably help out if that's what he wants to do. I try and keep up to date with what's happening within the industry, but when you're not involved in or on a day-to-day basis, it's hard to get involved, and it's probably better for me that I'm not, because if I was, I might be more all-consumed in it than I am at the moment.
Brilliant. So what does your day-to-day look like now? I believe you're involved in a business called Emerald Greens.
Yeah, basically Emerald Greens is vertical farming, and vertical farming is growing plants, herbs on flat platforms, and cascading water, grown inside under artificial lights. So it's sustainably grown because you're only using 10% of the water because you're recycling. It's no soil degeneration. So we don't use soil, we use water. It's sustainably grown. We have 100 solar panels. We've got a wind turbine. And basically my day, I don't need to really fill my day, and that doesn't fill my day, because although I'm the sales and strategy director, I don't have any product to sell, because everything that's actually grown, we already have a home for. So we're now just after putting in, it's old mushroom tunnels that my brother had. He has 8 of them. We've now got 3 of them transferred into a vertical farm that we're growing basil. We're the largest vertical farm on there's 2 categories of them, but let's say it's not the super duper massive big ones. There's maybe 2 or 3 of them in Europe. We're probably the biggest in Ireland. We're biggest in the UK. We produce about 400 kilos of basil every single week. That will probably go up towards 800 to 1,000 kilos by the end of the first quarter. And the good thing about it is that once I find a customer who's interested in buying, my brother does all the heavy lifting. He sows it, he cultivates it, he cuts it, he bags it, he delivers it, and all I have to do is send emails and try and find customers and make sure the customers we have are happy and that type of stuff. So it's not that it fills my day, it just gives me another interest. Yeah. And it's just something that he was over in Dubai as my son Paul is, and he went into a supermarket and he's seen them growing basil, mint, parsley in the supermarket, and he just thought this was amazing. And maybe it'll come to this country some stage, whereas like cutting your slice of ham or cutting your slice of ham or cheese, the person in the supermarket would just go with the scissors and clip fresh herbs for you, bag it and give it out. So we've a long way to go. We're Irish. 365 days consistent product comes on stream about every 35, 36 days. And we're trying to substitute Ethiopian, Kenyan, Egyptian basil that's brought in here that's probably 10 days old. And the difference between, what's available in the big supermarkets and what we send out to the food service sector is like chalk and cheese. So that's what I basically do, just to keep my hand in business in some respect. And I'm enjoying it. I've got a 50% stake in the business.
Okay.
So,
it keeps you interested.
Maybe someday we'll exit that as well. Yeah, it keeps me busy.
And who are your customers then? Are you selling to supermarkets?
Yeah, we don't. We sell to people who make pesto. So all the big pesto growers. So we were supplying Happy Pear. Galmer Food is probably the biggest supplier of pesto. They also do the Cully and Sully soups and that type of stuff. So they also into the UK. We sell to a lot of pesto growers. So they buy the basil and they make pesto. And then we also sell to food service. So Compass, who do a lot of corporate, they'd be in a lot of the big corporate, the Googles and the LinkedIns of this world, in the canteen world of there. And then food service in general, people who are supplying to hospitals and schools and that type of stuff. And then we have several customers in Cork and in Galway who deliver to restaurants.
Okay.
So that's ultimately where our product sort of ends up, that sort of way.
Okay.
So I'm very excited about next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the following Wednesday, Thursday. It's about bringing a product to market, and we will probably look at what other products we can make, whether that's sort of a basil oil or whether that's our own range of pestos. We've got a very good name in emerald greens that we think we could do something with on the supermarket floor and that type of stuff. So yeah, it's exciting times to see, can we get products. It may be Thai basil that we sell. It may be lemon basil. So there's loads of stuff that we would probably work at, and other products that we'd be looking at in the future.
Brilliant. Sounds very interesting.
I think, Aidan, one thing I find very fascinating is, you go from medical equipment to vertical farming.
Yeah.
Like, I know maybe it might come easier to you, but what would you recommend to people about like being open-minded and being willing to go into different industries like that and not being afraid of it? Like, what would be your suggestion to people of not being afraid to go into different things?
It's all about gut feeling. I really think it's very different. People who have overanalyzed, and if I was to overanalyze my weaknesses when I got involved in Medray, and if I was that type of personality, I'd have ran 100 miles from it. I'd have said, what the hell do I know about X-ray equipment? God's sake, medics, I was never in a hospital. So I never dealt with, I don't know anybody. I don't know any customers. It wasn't as if I was already dealing in there, And likewise with this, I go in and I sort of bluffed my way, and I suppose I did then too. I bluffed my way around, buyers and growers of herbs, whether they're buyers and, who are buying and selling and spent their life doing this. So I don't know, there's a side of me that if you're a salesman, you can actually sell anything. And if you believe in that, that sort of way. After that, it's, you bring a support mechanism around you to fill the weaknesses that you have. And that's pretty much what I've done. That sort of way. I'm not an avid reader. I'm not somebody who now knows all about basil and how it grows and the mineral levels and the HP this and all, alkaline levels. I haven't got a clue. But you normally find that people really don't want, when they want to talk technical, they really don't want to talk to me. They want to talk to a technical person. And that's whether, and when I want to talk to my brother about, people who want to see the farm, I don't need to go down. I don't add an awful lot by going down to the farm, and somebody who wants to know how to learn how to grow basil. And it's the exact same with, if I needed somebody on a medical side and a clinical side, I brought them with me. And, sometimes a little knowledge is dangerous. So maybe I'm better off being miles away from it. Yeah, I suppose for me, the only thing I had growing up was that I probably had the ability to sell, and to a certain degree, a likability, that sort of way. I've had people in that I just immediately I've try to sell me stuff and I just don't like them. And I suppose I wouldn't say I had a pretty face, that sort of way. No, I just, I just a good rapport with people or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
Very good.
And
That's great.
just being able to transition from one to the other.
It's great advice. So we finish up with three thoughtful questions. So what was the biggest lesson you've learned from a mistake you've made?
Ooh. You know what? I don't think you go out to make mistakes. I think you make a decision based on what you have, and then as a consequence or in hindsight, that becomes a mistake. And you know what? When I look at it and I look at mistakes that I made in hindsight, one of the ones that's cost me more sleepless nights, believe it or not, was actually picking the wrong staff member. Because you pick somebody and you think they're a right fit for the company and you think they're the right fit for the job. And then 6, 12, 18 months, they actually are the wrong fit. And you begin to see traits and you begin to see that they don't fit into the culture. And believe it or not, I probably lost more sleep wondering how I was going to get rid of this person. What will I do with this person? How will I deliver from an emotional point of view, from a human point of view? How would you deliver to somebody that you're actually going to let them go? That sort of way. So the mistakes I've made are probably the ones that have cost me most sleepless nights have been probably the staff piece, because we're all human and it's something that we don't like to do, but sometimes you have to do for the good of the business. And I know nowadays it's an awful lot more difficult to get rid of the wrong person than it was probably 10, 15, 20 years ago. Yeah. And I think that's probably the mistake, hiring the wrong person, and not probably given that the consideration I should have given to some of the decisions I made to get involved in medical or get involved in Emerald Greens. Probably not making the right choices. And as I say, you think they're the right choices, but it's very difficult.
And how did you get better at hiring, or is it just
give the job to somebody else, Alan? Give the job to somebody else. And then it's their job to get rid of them. I mean to say, look at probably agencies. As I said, we did have HR departments, and they were a little bit more rigorous than probably I was. There was a time during those 20 years when you gave the job to the person who came up, attended the interview, because they might have been the only one that attended the interview. So yeah, I think that's how I probably got over that piece. I'm a mentor with 2 or 3 other friends in businesses. I see, the nightmares that they go through. Give the problem to somebody else.
What's the best piece of advice, Aidan, you've ever received?
Oh, best piece of advice I've ever received. That's a difficult one, Sean. The Jerry Kennelly who told me to do it myself, because after I sold the business, I had 2 or 3 phone calls from competitors that didn't realise that Medray was for sale. And that was a piece of advice in hindsight that I wasn't entertaining, but in hindsight was probably good, because I might have got a better price. There might have been different people to work with because of that process. That was certainly a good bit of advice.
Yeah.
Can't think of anything else. I'm trying to think some sort of a life lesson that somebody may have said to me, but
I think that's pretty good. I mean, it's like the old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer with your assailant and stuff. So I think that's a pretty good piece of advice.
So, and then the last one is, so someone who is probably semi-retired, what for you is a life well lived, and how do you make the most of it?
Well, look, I suppose to half answer the advice piece from Sean is, my advice is to get out and enjoy life, in terms of, if you've been in business for 20, 30, 40 years and your business has a value, don't wait to come out in the box. get out and get a price that will give you the life well lived, as you said. On Saturday, I'll bury a very, very good friend of mine. His name is Bernard McCarthy. He was the DHL CEO here in Ireland. He was 62 years of age. I played football with him for 10, 12 years. I ran a golf society. We golfed for 10 or 12 years. And you know what? Life is for living now. And, you know, that fella had probably similar plans. And I know he did because he was planning to retire. But within 12 months, he's got cancer. And unfortunately, he died yesterday. And I would say to people out there, from the best piece of advice I could give them, and to a white level, to living a good life, get out, enjoy yourself, because you're here for a good time, not for a long time.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thanks so much for how honest you were throughout. It's just been a real pleasure and great insight listening to you for the last whatever it was hour, and it flew by. But thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, no, thanks a million, Aidan. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Can I just wish both of you two guys the very best of luck with your podcast, and I hope you go from strength to strength.
Thanks very
much.
Thanks
very much, Aidan. We appreciate it.
Cheers, guys.
And if you come across anyone who you might think be a good guest for us to have on the interview as well, let us know. We'd love to.
I will, of course, yeah.
Shine
no,
yeah.